Welcome back everybody to another episode of Direct Comparison. In today's episode, we're going to take an in-depth look at the widely popular low-poly sandbox shooter game BattleBit Remastered, and see how it compares to DICE and EA's most recent entry to the Battlefield franchise, Battlefield 2042. For this analysis, both games are being played on the PC, with the graphics settings pushed up to their highest available settings at a native 4K resolution. Though, as you can no doubt already tell, the budget for one of these titles is considerably higher than the other. So, while we will look at some visual elements throughout the course of this video, the primary goal is to not necessarily determine which game looks better, but rather which game actually delivers that quintessential Battlefield experience, and what unique gameplay features set these two titles apart. Alright, so let's address the elephant in the room first, and talk about the graphics. Now obviously, the game with the bigger budget, in this case Battlefield, is going to look visually superior in just about every way, with higher fidelity character models, animations, gorgeous environmental artwork, texture maps, shaders, lighting, and top quality effects. Though, BattleBit's simplistic art direction does a surprisingly good job in capturing the essence of these chaotic war zones, while lacking all that visual eye candy, and has allowed the incredibly small team of developers behind the project to rapidly expand on the amount of content in a way that's just not realistically possible for DICE and EA within the same time frame. Take the character models for example. Because BattleBit uses a bunch of ridiculously simple blocky figures for their character models, there's a bit more player customization available already, with players able to modify the face and uniform to suit their preference. They're goofy looking as can be, and honestly could benefit from a little bit more geometry to match up with the weirdly more detailed weapon designs. And I think having a deeper contrasting color between either team would help significantly in target acquisition, as these small colored lights on uniforms just aren't enough, forcing players to rely much more heavily on the game's already crowded UI elements. That being said, BattleBit does at least avoid the trap of Battlefield 2042's divisive specialist design, keeping the focus on the tactical action, as opposed to specialist-specific gimmicky gadgets, an aspect that I'll discuss in more detail in a bit. Next, we have the environments. This is probably one of BattleBit's biggest advantages over the latest Battlefield, as the game, even in its early access state, has an incredible amount of map variety already. It's all here. The desert cities, the forested hillsides, the sprawling war-torn valleys. These are all the types of maps that cemented my love for the Battlefield franchise in the first place. Though, these maps are also considerably bigger than the average Battlefield map, with a huge draw distance and lots of terrain variety to ensure each cluster of objectives feels visually distinct from one another. Swapping back to 2042, we once again had to acknowledge the ridiculous gap in visual quality, as the worlds here look considerably better, with some really impressive vegetation, geometry design, and, since the many reworks to the map designs themselves, much better combat zones in general. I was especially impressed by the 5 newer maps that have released since launch, as they seem to have a much more focused flow to their objectives regardless of the game mode, and have a far more consistent visual style to boot. The map Flashpoint even seems to pay homage to a classic Battlefield 2142 map, with a similar linear canyon design and crisscrossing catwalks and industrial spaces, making it stand apart nicely from the rest of the selection. BattleBit's nearly non-existent use of textures and very minimal unique asset placement gives it an edge here, as the modern warfare direction that the developers appear to be aiming for shines through more clearly and keeps the action more grounded as a result. Maps are also densely packed with abandoned vehicles, pipes, sandbags, and other debris that give it a really lived-in feel, and the addition of the voxel destruction mechanics make the experience feel like more of a sandbox to play around in, whereas Battlefield 2042's maps are uncharacteristically strict and unwavering. BattleBit's rudimentary lighting design also lends itself nicely to the game's already solid map variety. Using Unity's more general lighting systems, BattleBit's many maps can be toggled between day or night very easily, with the latter often requiring players to make use of night vision to help navigate the environment. Weather also appears to be available in BattleBit with things like heavy rainfall, though it seems this doesn't appear to be dynamically available in most maps, and the effect itself with the thick, gray, opaque lines isn't particularly amazing looking. Battlefield, on the other hand, on top of its already excellent lighting design, does have some of the dynamic weather effects used in the past few entries of the series, with some maps loading in with heavy rainfall, sandstorms, and even large tornadoes. Though night options are locked to only certain maps with no options to toggle to a daytime version, likely due to the static shadow and lighting probes used in the much more advanced Frostbite engine. 2042 also benefits from the use of ray-traced ambient occlusion, enhancing the game's geometry with more accurate shadows that really help add some much-needed depth to each scene. Whereas BattleBit's very simple approach leaves interior spaces looking bland and unrealistically illuminated. Then of course, there's the effects. Effects are a big part of these sandbox shooter games, as fire, explosions, water, and destruction overall can help to really sell the action-packed Battlefield experience. In the right light, 2042 can look phenomenal with its effects, with some impressive explosions that light up a massive space and shake the screen in a way that really sells the intensity of the situation. Water and raindrops will glisten along the barrels of the player's weapon in the rain, wind will blow trees and grass, and big muddy tracks can be formed by driving heavy vehicles over wet dirt. But one of the biggest complaints lobbed at the game is its poor implementation of its destructive elements, an aspect that has become synonymous with the Battlefield brand ever since the debut of Bad Company. Sure, some larger structures can still be destroyed, and there's a few buildings that can be blown apart with explosives, but these destructible surfaces are few and far between. BattleBit, on the other hand, has the advantage of using a sort of voxel destruction design, allowing many of its structures to break apart with some nice stylized physics applied to the few blocks holding them together. There's even a few large-scale Levolution events thrown in, including some direct homages to games like Battlefield 3. Though, even still, the destruction in BattleBit isn't perfect, as there's many larger structures that can't be destroyed at all, and there's a disappointing lack of geometry deformation that I feel would have really benefited a game like this. So, in summary, BattleBit's graphics are obviously nothing to write home about, with ridiculously blocky characters holding semi-realistic looking weapons in environments lacking any sort of direct lighting outside of the default world lighting. But even without all the visual bells and whistles, BattleBit delivers in an area that Battlefield 2042 is severely lacking in, and that's the overall amount of core game content and general gameplay focus. The reason why you've probably seen so many people praising this BattleBit game lately is that it really is a lot like what Battlefield typically plays like. The game pits two larger teams of players against each other in massive sandbox environments, with squads of players working together using class-specific weapons and roles to diversify the action on the field. Depending on the map, vehicles may also be made available to players, which can turn the tide of battle if used properly. However, despite all of its similarities, there is an important distinction here that I feel is worth pointing out. BattleBit isn't aiming to play like the typical casual Battlefield experience, but rather the more hardcore-oriented experience instead. The time to kill, for example, is considerably lower than you'd see in Battlefield, with only a few shots being enough to kill a player. Injuries also require the player to bandage themselves, a feature only ever really offered in community-made mods and military sims like Project Reality, Arma, and Squad. Meanwhile, spawns seem to be much more limited in this game, preventing players from spawning on any objective currently being contested, even if your own team still has control of the point. This forces large groups of players to spawn far away from the action, and slows down the action considerably. You can still spawn on squad members just like in Battlefield, which is usually the ideal option to cut down on travel time. Though, like Battlefield, you won't be able to spawn on them when they're under fire, and the criteria for this seems to be even more sensitive. Then there's the vehicles, that simply don't handle as well as the Battlefield series. Like other military sim games, vehicles in BattleBit require players to start the engine first before driving, and even require a long warm-up time before things like helicopters can take flight. The physics are either too floaty or too heavy-handed here, making it extremely difficult to control for precise aiming. And vehicles seem to sustain much more damage when under direct fire, making them feel considerably weaker than those in Battlefield. 2042's vehicles still aren't nearly as good as past Battlefield games, with the chopper's gun still not lining up properly with the player's crosshair, and general balancing of things like gunships, tanks, and AA vehicles still not feeling quite right. But I did find myself enjoying the vehicle gameplay in 2042 significantly more than in BattleBit when trying them both back to back. The one thing I will say that I much prefer in BattleBit in regards to vehicles though, is that the developers have opted for the classic method for retrieving vehicles from the field, with Humvees, helicopters, and tanks all spawning on the ground back. I also feel the specific vehicle layout depending on the map helps considerably in maintaining a distinctive vision for each environment, as 2042's over-reliance on player freedom and sandbox gunplay makes the game feel almost too chaotic, with things like hovercrafts, tanks, bolts, and a multitude of different helicopters making for completely nonsensical engagements. The vehicle variety is great, but I think keeping certain vehicles locked to certain maps helps to give those locations a unique identity, and makes the experience easier to balance as well. Speaking of vehicle variety, it's also worth noting that while BattleBit does have a lot of the classics you'd expect like Humvees, rib boats, jet skis, APCs, tanks, and helicopters, it interestingly does not feature any form of jet fighters at the moment. Even more peculiar than this though, is that BattleBit doesn't feature any parachutes. This means players in helicopters are forced to either wait for the pilot to land, or use the deployable fast ropes to quickly descend to the ground below. This also prevents players in elevated structures from parachuting, which is more of a risk to players if they find themselves pinned down. Finally, there's the actual infantry movement and combat itself, which arguably feels better in BattleBit than it does in 2042. A big part of this is the player movement animations that feature a lot more of that back and forth arm sway on screen to sell the illusion of momentum in a way that 2042 just doesn't deliver. Vaulting animations than those in the latest Battlefield game. Gunplay is also more tight and consistent, with good visual recoil relative to the weapon being fired. One of the first things I noticed when booting up 2042 after all this time is just how awkward the gunplay feels, with the recoil seemingly not matching up with the sound effects and target response. It's hard to really pinpoint exactly what's off, but it's not an issue either BattleBit or previous Battle games seem to suffer from. BattleBit also incorporates the traditional class-based soldier system that Battlefield had helped pioneer in the first place, with most major weapon types being locked to a class with a designated role on the field. Classes include the Assault, which makes use of assault rifles and more aggressive gadgets like grappling hooks and riot shields. The Medic, that also can use assault rifles along with SMGs and carbines, and are responsible for providing health and quickly reviving players. The Engineer, that along with all the previous weapon types can also use DMRs, along with various types of RPG launchers to combat vehicles. The Support class, that makes use of the game's machine guns and provides ammunition, and the Recon class, that can provide intel to their team while also sniping at targets from long range. BattleBit also offers a unique Squad Leader class as well, which functions mostly like the Assault class, though with the added benefit of additional grenades and bandages, along with the ability to call in unique squad reinforcements like airstrikes. Battlefield 2042 initially did not release with any classes. Instead, DICE opted to go the Rainbow Six Siege route, and featured several various specialists, each with their own unique identity and signature gadget. With this new direction, weapons were no longer tied to classes, allowing players to freely customize their loadout to their heart's content. However, by doing this, the game's traditional combat flow was severely disrupted, giving snipers access to rocket launchers, and medics access to sniper rifles. The game has since attempted to address this divisive change by placing specialists into 4 more traditional class categories, limiting things like the rocket launchers, health kits, and ammunition crates to their respective class type, while still retaining each specialist's unique device. But base weapons still remain open-ended and available to use across each of these 4 classes, with only minor passive benefits. Identifying a soldier class on the field before would give some indication of what type of firepower they were packing, allowing the player to adjust tactics to overcome them. But now, it's a total grab bag, and players never really know what to expect until it's too late. making for an overall frustrating experience. As I mentioned previously, player identification in BattleBit still isn't necessarily great, as the overly simplistic character designs make it very difficult to identify targets without the use of the UI indicators. And this, in a way, really illustrates the problem with trying to incorporate too many customization options into these really big team-based shooter games, as the only real indication that these are two separate countries fighting each other is the flag icon on either game's scoreboard. Now, there's a lot more that can be said between these two games, as there's a ton of different weapons, vehicles, and subtle distinctions that can be made. But for the sake of time, let's listen to a few sound comparisons. Which game do you feel has the better audio quality and design? And that wraps up this episode of Direct Comparison. Overall, BattleBit is an incredibly impressive achievement when considering the very small development team and the sheer scope of the content already on offer in this early access build. There's dozens of maps, plenty of weapons, a full customization suite, and some really solid gameplay systems that harken back to the more streamlined Battlefield experience that fans have been desperately waiting for. Battlefield 2042 is undoubtedly in a better state than it was 2 years ago. The game's level variety has been boosted a decent amount, thanks to reintroducing the portal maps into the mix, along with 5 new maps and several reworks to the poorly received base maps. And general quality of life improvements like reintroducing the class system, cleaning up the squad management, and having a functional scoreboard have helped bring the game closer to the feeling of a traditional Battlefield title. But it's still not quite right, and I believe that's why BattleBit, despite its silly-looking appearance, is growing so rapidly in popularity. If anything, this comparison demonstrates the importance of the core gameplay design over visual effects, and it'll be interesting to see if this game's success may influence the direction of the Battlefield series moving forward. But what do you guys think? Are you enjoying BattleBit, or do you still prefer the Battlefield series? Let me know in the comments section. If you want to learn more about the Battlefield series, be sure to check out my extensive documentary on the franchise, including several interviews with many of Battlefield's biggest content creators. Also, if you haven't already, be sure to check out my newest documentary on Naughty Dog's hit series The Last of Us, available now on my channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this posted every week.